Today we're going to talk about critique, about how to give it and how to receive it. So once you've written a first draft of a story and you've maybe redrafted it, you have to, the first step that you can do is to just engage in self-critique. So you wrote a story. It's important not to edit too much while you're reading it, but rather to just wait a little bit. Let it sit, create some distance, and then you have to look at the work with a dispassionate eye. Not a horrible critic, because there is this tendency to think, oh no, this is just terrible, this is horrible, the whole thing just majorly sucks. So you don't want to be that critic, because obviously that way you will not write any stories. But you also don't want to be the critic who spares your feelings. You have to be a bit like an outside reviewer. Not like the horrible reviewer 2 who wants to slash the paper, but like the benevolent reviewer 1 who has proper distance, who is dispassionate, but who looks critically at what's working and what isn't working, and who's prepared to cut out things that look very nice but that actually don't really work in the story. So that's one step. Then, secondly, you can also look at the criticisms of other people. Preferably, these are people who have some distance from you, maybe not somebody very close to you. Or if it's somebody close to you, then it's somebody who doesn't want to spare your feelings particularly, but is honest. Now, Eric Schwitzgebel has this great piece, and I'm putting it in the links here in the description, that you should write for the 10%, as he calls it. Most people's work is not for everyone. The exceptions perhaps being peak stories by great authors that everybody likes. So, for instance, Flowers for Algernon is universally liked. The Paper Menagerie is a story that many people like. Pride and Prejudice is a book that's almost universally beloved. But most authors, even most great authors, are not to everyone's taste. So, for example, it seems that, informally polling among friends, that many philosophers seems to despise Hemingway. And yet lots of people also really enjoy Hemingway. So the question is, who are you writing for? You have to write for the 10% of people who might potentially be interested in your story. Ignore the feedback of friends, family who don't really like your story, but rather take very seriously the feedback of the people who at least have the potential to love your story. So those are the criticisms you have to take most seriously. Moreover, if a person says, and this is a tip by Neil Gaiman, if this just isn't working for me, or it's unclear for me, then that person is per definition right. If a person says, I don't understand what's happening, well, clearly it isn't working for them, it's unclear for them, and they don't understand why it happens. So they're always right, and you really have to take this seriously. However, Gaiman also thinks that the advice on how to improve you have to take with a grain of salt. So sometimes people might say, look, this particular passage in the story is just not working for me. Maybe you should put in something romantic. Well, maybe, but maybe you just don't want to write romance, and then you have to wonder why isn't it working? What causes the person to think it isn't working, and try to fix that, and not necessarily go with their solution. So you really have to be sort of very cognizant of what you take away and what you don't. Then, if it is your turn to critique the work of others, then be like a benevolent reviewer 1. It's really helpful to say what works and to say, look, this is very, very beautiful, this is very nicely done, but you also have to say what doesn't work. So you have to clearly state, like, I don't understand why this is happening. Because very often what happens in a story, so here are some common problems of stories that are very difficult for authors themselves to realize what's going on. Problem 1 is very often the author understands why something is happening, but the reader doesn't. So for example, you could have you could critique somebody saying, why is she breaking up with him? So suddenly, why? This comes out of the blue. The author says, no, it doesn't come out of the blue. There's plenty of hints that she was unhappy. Look, there's this there, go a few pages back and then you see this. But the problem is, it's just too implicit because you have more in your mind about the character and the story than ultimately ends up on the page. And so very often, A simple fix is just be a bit more explicit, put a bit more in of what really matters and don't keep it too implicit. So it's very helpful for a critique to point that out. The second problem that you don't see anymore is inconsistency. So you write a story, you rewrite a story, you add some detail. But then the problem is the interesting stuff that you add might just not be consistent overall, and you just don't know it anymore because you know the story too well. So it's very handy if somebody can point out to you inconsistencies. And the third problem is problems with pacing. So sometimes the story goes too quick and the transition is just not clear at all, but sometimes it just also starts becoming all muddled and you start thinking, what's the point of all these descriptions? And descriptions can be wonderful, obviously, but you can have a really slow story, and nevertheless, even in the slow story, it's important to get the pacing right. So it's very helpful to hear things from reviewers such as, I started skimming starting page 4, all that subplot about, people visiting a garden or something, because even though you think it's beautiful and it's interesting, it still might be that the story loses momentum there and that you need to cut. So those are the main things to do, giving criticism and receiving it.